Go, we're live.
Hello and welcome to the New Reel. I'm Drew Hemment and I'm joined today by Jake Elwes, Anna Ridler, Caroline Sinders and Mahir Yavuz. The New Reel is the theme of an online curatorial project at the Edinburgh International Festival this year by the Edinburgh Futures Institute. It comes out of a research theme called Experiential AI, where we're looking to support the creation of significant new artistic works using machine learning and robotics, and where we're interested in the contributions that art can make to AI, how artists can help answer questions for AI practitioners and researchers, and how the arts can help society navigate the profound transformation brought about by AI. The New Reel also responds to the current crisis. Following the pandemic, we're even more reliant on digital interfaces, and in our life online, it's increasingly difficult to understand what is real and what is not, and COVID is normalizing this. So it's all the more urgent to understand the way that technology reflects and shapes our social reality. In Edinburgh, we've been collaborating with Anna and Caroline, and also with Jake, on 2 cooperative research studies, and we've been supporting each of them to develop major new bodies of work. This involves collaboration with Ars Electronica as part of the AI lab, and today we're delighted to welcome Mahir to join us. When the pandemic struck, we, like many of you, had to pivot and recalibrate what we're doing. We asked the artists if they'd like to shift direction and address the pandemic in their work. They all answered yes. The result is some commissioned new work, 2 works which will open on the 17th of October as part of Edinburgh International Festival, and a series of discussions and essays exploring the New Reel theme. The world was already strange and dark, and it just got stranger and darker. We believe the arts can help us navigate this and can bring us some hope and joy. We're going to kick off with some introductions from the artists, and first up, Jake Elwes.
Hello. So I'm Jake Elwes. I'm a London-based artist, and I've been using machine learning for around the last 5 years. I suppose my interest to start with was a lot about questions of agency and kind of artificial consciousness and kind of how far you can push these systems to create autonomous artworks. But more recently, I've become more and more interested in reframing and recontextualizing machine learning techniques and thinking about ways of creating narratives and poetry around the issues of artificial intelligence, as well as actually using the techniques in the work. So I'd like to start off by showing a little bit of my work. So here we've got, I'll give you a bit of background to this. So this is a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years, and it's called ZZ. The first piece was called ZZ Querying the Dataset, and the idea was that I took a standardized data set of thousands and thousands of faces. This was used for Celeb A HQ, used for StyleGAN, which is a common technique used for generating these fake faces. You might have seen some of them. But the idea was to take these kind of quite homogeneous faces that have been generally gathered by American engineers and inject them with queerness, because there's a serious lack of representation in these systems, and thinking about who they're trained on, who is gathering these data sets. So the idea was to shift, if you like, this already trained network into this queerer space, and all of the weights inside the network kind of shifted when I injected it with drag kings and drag queens. So I'm going to show you an extract of these faces kind of morphing and flowing between different identities. So here's a video about to start. This is ZZ, and all of these faces are constructed using a generative adversarial network. And like I say, it's using drag as a way to explore otherness and queerness, and thinking about these issues of, assimilation into the network, but also lack of representation and kind of these conflicts within these systems and how they're built. So as you can see, these kind of faces are constantly shifting. These images you see here are from the original model, and they're kind of these hyper-realistic, quite strange, uncanny faces. And then after injecting it with 1,000 images of drag performers, this is what was the results. So this showed as part of the Edinburgh Festival last year in 2019, and we had it projected down the side of a building, 9 of them running down the street. So leading on from that, I'd like to briefly talk about this next project that I started created during lockdown. And what we really wanted to do, so I started talking to Drew, Hemment, and the Edinburgh Futures Institute about creating a staged piece and really exploring performance with machine learning, which is an area that hasn't been so explored, and thinking about how we can use deepfake technology to create this character. This character, again, called ZZ. So ZZ is the Z vector, which is how you control the latent space and the representation that you're getting, the generated image, and the Z pronoun, non-binary pronoun. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what we created just as lockdown was starting, and we had to create a video. We wanted to create a staged piece, but obviously as lockdown developed, we weren't really able to do that. So I'll show you a short extract of what we did create, and then I'll talk briefly about the next phase of the project, which is what we're currently developing. So here is a short extract of a duet between a well-known London drag performer, drag queen. She's called Me the Drag Queen on Instagram, and ZZ, who's this sort of deepfake doppelganger version of me. So here's a short extract of that.
Any note you can sing, I can sing higher.
I can sing any note higher than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
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 How do you sing that high?
I'm a girl.
Anything you can say, I can say softer.
I can say anything softer than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
So as you can see, it's this bizarre musical theater duet between an AI deepfake doppelganger and the real drag queen. I suppose the reason that we're doing this, or what we're thinking about, is this idea of in drag, drag is a constructed identity. It's a way of challenging gender. Drag queens, drag kings, it's a way of rethinking and challenging society's notions of gender. It's a construction, it's a constructed identity. And then we've created a constructed deepfake version of that in a virtual space. And I guess this is particularly prescient at the moment during lockdown, when a lot of queer venues are having to shut down and are really struggling to be thinking about these kind of virtual spaces and cabaret and what it means to kind of be doing cabaret in this post-COVID world. So I suppose, yeah, thinking about that, but also thinking about explainability and thinking about the way that we often mystify artificial intelligence by anthropomorphizing it and by thinking of it as this humanoid form. In a way, what we're doing here is satiring that and satiring the notion that AI is going to be taking our jobs and kind of saying maybe it's, we can be a bit more playful and fun about it, and thinking about, an artificial intelligence taking the job of a drag queen is kind of ridiculous and wonderful to think about. So thinking about that, explainability, but also literally opening up the black box of how these techniques are working. So this is, done with pose detection, and it's what's called a conditional GAN. So you train it on a body, and then it turns that body into a skeleton. I've got a few little breakdowns here which kind of show the process. So it turns it into a skeleton, and then it can learn to create a kind of body, a skin on top of that. And then once you've got this technique that can convert skeletons to bodies, you can feed in any movement that you want by anybody to create a deep fake image. So a way that we're kind of unpacking that is to try and show these skeletons and show these techniques as you experience the work. So that is what we're thinking about at the moment. So the next phase of the project, which we're releasing as part of the new reel, the exhibition on October the 17th, is going to be a virtual cabaret. And what I've been doing over the last few weeks is doing distance photo shoots and filming to create data sets of 13 different drag performers, all quite well-established drag performers in the London scene. And they are a complete range of genders and different backgrounds. And, you know, we've got drag kings and trans drag queens and all of these different identities. But then to think about the politics of what happens when you take one movement or the act of one performer and switch it with the body of a different performer. Every time you do this, the skeleton below will be revealed and you'll kind of get an insight into how the technology and technique is working. It's also this sense of a virtual cabaret because we're going to create a kind of stage in your browser that you can interactively control, and that even has a host that will kind of come on and explain to you the acts and what's going on. So this is going to be part of the new reel opening on the 17th of October. And yeah, keep an eye out. At ZZDrag is the tag on Instagram and Twitter, and we'll got a lot more to come.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jake. Really great, and lots to unpack and explore when we get into discussion. I'm now going to invite Anna and Caroline, who have come together, as they'll explain, and collaborating for the first time together as part of this partnership. And so perhaps you'd like to give a bit about each of your background and then some of your ambitions for the project looking ahead.
Sure. Caroline, do you want to go first with the background?
Sure. So Anna and I are two different AI artists who have been deep fans of each other's work for a really long time. And we saw a call with Ars Electronica for the AI lab with EFI and wanted to work on a project together, sort of combining a couple different topics that we had been thinking about in our own separate practices. One of our projects is one that we're exploring through our fellowship, is looking at artificial intelligence and climate change, and generally the climate. So we're using AI as its way to explore. Though we both have different backgrounds and practices that we'll be getting into. We are currently working on a project also to be shown soon in the Edinburgh Festival, where we're exploring varying kinds of sounds related to climate and then also related to industrial factories and just sort of the general industrial landscape that we live in. And do you want to add anything, or should we then do presentations?
No, I think so. If I just quickly, I can give a bit of background as to my practice. So as Caroline mentioned, we both kind of are very interested in how AI works at a very fundamental level and unpicking it and exploring it from its roots, and thinking about things to do with labor, to do with kind of all of the hidden aspects of kind of working with AI, with kind of understanding how it works from its very start to its very end. And one of the things that we realized when we started kind of like looking at this and exploring it together was that we don't really have a real understanding of anything that happens around energy, climate change, and the ecological impact and footprint of machine learning. So that's kind of like also how we came to it. To kind of like just give a little bit of background as to how this fits into kind of my broader practice, is that I have always been interested for about a decade at looking at how knowledge is kind of produced, circulated, and how it changes over time. I've also been really interested recently in looking at kind of scientific ways of thinking and scientific practice as kind of like a phenomena to explore how society works. So I'm really interested at looking at machine learning through the lenses of kind of systems of knowledge, and kind of like the way that you can kind of know things through this kind of process and make this process of knowledge kind of like available and open to all. My practice kind of spans lots of different things: technology, literature, sound, installation, photography, but always comes back to kind of several different kind of ways of working. I work extremely heavily with self-generated data sets and have done for many, many years. I'm very interested in making information physical, and how I'm very interested in kind of using the technological to bring out the human. And I'm also really interested in using quite small things, small objects, as a way of kind of opening up into larger subjects. So I did a lot of work kind of with WikiLeaks, but started at the kind of scale of a love letter. So yeah, I'm really interested in working with machine learning, not just because of the ways that it can do things that were kind of like impossible 10, 15 years ago, but because the very structure of how it works kind of reveals so much about society, and what kind of is revealed when we see that kind of like the choices and the structures that we choose to put in it mirrored and reflected back at us. So how that kind of manifests itself in my work is, if I share my screen, desktop one, share. Oh no, I don't seem to be able to share my screen. I probably should have done this beforehand and tested it, but the way that I worked with this, so I can't share any photos, it looks like. Let me just check. Can you see my screen? Is it shared?
No, I don't see it.
No, okay, well, a way that I've worked through that practice has been in a project that won an honorary mention last year at Ars Electronica in the AI and Life Arts category. Was a large project that I did called Mosaic Virus and Myriad, where I kind of built my own data set. I spent many, many months in the Netherlands as part of the EMAP residency 2 years ago, building a data set of tulips. I took photographs of 10,000 tulips. And what was really nice about that number was that even though it was an incredibly technological project, the reason why I stopped at 10,000 was because tulip season ended. I then had this kind of big database of tulips. I then hand categorized them, deciding on things like shape and color, what type of tulip it was, what kind of like, what stage it was in, so if it was bud or dying. And that's a huge amount of work. It's work that was often hidden. So then I created an installation of the data set of all of these photographs with the labels on them, which is about 50 square meters when it's all installed by itself. It's only been shown in its entirety once because it's quite a big piece. And the reason why I put all of this effort and energy into creating this data set is because I knew that I wanted to create a GAN of a tulip, because I was making a piece called Mosaic Virus, which was kind of talking about and making connections between the hype around Bitcoin, the hype around tulip mania, which was a historical phenomenon in the 17th century, and the hype around AI, and collapsing those historical moments together. And the way I was using the technology was the way that kind of GANs work. You get things like mode collapse, you get things about, and kind of the way the technology works. I was trying to echo these kind of moments of speculation in it. In the moving image piece, the GAN is controlled by the price of Bitcoin, and the tulips become more stripy as the price of Bitcoin goes up. So you're able to kind of see the fluctuations in the market in this kind of quite poetic way. That kind of like, and I was really interested in exploring kind of both the ways that you can kind of like unpick, and the more you learn about the technology, the more you're able to make these connections between how these moments of how things work kind of mirror the subject matter. And then also kind of like the process and the way that it's built up can kind of start to reveal things as well about how these things work. I might be able to share my screen now. Let me see if I can do it. I'm getting a message from Drew. Yes, now I can share it. So you should be able to see. Can you see now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so these are some of the tulips. This is me kind of like, this is the thousands of them. This is a small shot of the installation that I was talking about. This is a larger shot of part of the installation. This is the GAN piece that was very nicely set up, kind of like in the installation shot of the tulips that are blooming and then kind of collapsing as the price of Bitcoin goes up and down. And then this is a short video that kind of also kind of shows the GAN and shows the kind of like these impossible tulips ever moving according to the price of the stock market. I think there are really nice connections between kind of like ecology and metaphors in machine learning, something that Caroline and I did a separate talk on with a scientist at Edinburgh University. And I think there are so many ways that kind of like the history of natural history, the history of botany can reveal so much about kind of power dynamics, labor dynamics, and also kind of our attitude and relationship to nature and the natural world, and reveal kind of like how we're thinking about this technology now. Thank you.
Great. And I would love to share a little bit more about my own personal practice as well. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Great, awesome. So I'm really also excited to be here and to be in collaboration with Anna over the past few months and continuing into the next few months in the next year. So my background is in design research and in photography. But I'm really interested in processes and how technology impacts society, often through the lens of harm and harm reduction. So a lot of the work that I do isn't just art, it's also research in civil society. So I've done work with the Carter Center, the United Nations. In 2018, I worked briefly with Facebook to help them think through online harassment and online harassment reporting. I've worked with the Wikimedia Foundation on the anti-harassment team. And I've held residencies with IBEAM, Pioneer Works, and the Mozilla Foundation. What I'm interested in is how you can use theory and social justice as lenses and frameworks for interrogating technology. So Feminist Dataset is a critical design and process-driven art research project that uses Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectional feminism as a framework for investigating every single step of the machine learning pipeline, so such as data collection, data training, the different tools and processes that are used in machine learning, like how do you label and structure data, to then the use of neural networks and eventually new forms of user interface, which will then create a feminist AI chatbot. And this work is really inspired by other works that have come before mine. So it's inspired by the Maker Movement, General Critical Design, Arte Utile, the Critical Engineering Manifesto, Xenofeminism, and then the Feminist Principles of the Internet. So Feminist Dataset is this multi-year project designed to look at bias inside of machine learning. And also thinking about what does context and anecdotal data in text really look like. Pedagogically, Feminist Dataset operates in a similar vein to Thomas Thwaites' Toaster project, in which Thwaites builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore to building circuits and creating a new plastic body mold. Feminist Dataset is similar, though, however, it takes a critical and artistic view on software as opposed to hardware and looks particularly at machine learning. So the process of creating, of rethinking every step is the majority of the art project. It manifests in things like workshops, in printed matter, and in times of the creation of new tools. So with my fellowship with the Mozilla Foundation, I created an open source tool that artists and labs and startups can use to train and label their own data sets. So it's an open source and more usable version of something like Mechanical Turk. In conjunction with that, I also created a provocation of a wage calculator to try to help creators think through how time is related to labor and pricing. So trying to look at the underpricing of microservice tasks. While this seems adjacent to AI, it's human labor that often trains and and structures these data sets. So there are human hands involved in this process. Feminist data set asks that we re-examine every part of the machine learning pipeline, including even structuring and labeling data sets through this feminist lens. And much like Thwaite's toaster, every step has to actually function and work. In a more deeper sense, feminist data set is imagining data creation and data sets and even the act of archiving as an act of protest and an act of witnessing. So in a time where so much personal data is caught and then hidden by large technology companies, which can then be used for targeted advertising and algorithmic suggestions, what does it mean to make a data set about a political ideology, one that is then also made by multiple people? So it's made by a community of attendees of workshops. And then it's asking, well, what is feminist in this practice in terms of data collection? How can data sets come from creative spaces, and how can they truly be communal acts and works? What's possible about a data set when the community is making it as a reflection of themselves? So it can be a self-portrait, it can be protest, it can be a demand to be seen, it can be an intervention or confrontation. It is inherently political. So what about a system that then interprets that data? What if systems were all open to critique as well as community input? And these are the questions that feminist data set is asking. And I pull these questions and this kind of rigor from my research practice of working in civil society, of looking at the harms and the extent of technology as it sort of intervenes inside of our everyday lives. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna and Caroline, and thank you for riding out those small technical difficulties. Mahir, over to you.
Thanks, Drew. Happy to be here. Excited for the conversation part. My name is Mahir Yavuz. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York City, working in the fields of data science and AI, respectively, in the last 10, 15 years. Had the opportunity to work at our Electronica Future Lab for many years, and also had the chance to collaborate to the festival, contribute to the festival a few times before in similar fields. I consider myself more on the research side recently than the artistic practice. So what I'm going to share maybe is a little bit different than what we have seen so far. But I think it's kind of interesting to bring like the perspective of research and AI applications in business life as well. So I'm just going to show just two things very quickly and keep the intro very brief. I hope you can see my screen. So I'm a founder of a company called Topos. We are doing location intelligence after COVID started. Obviously, we pivoted everything we were doing. And one of the main things that we were focusing on is this COVID-19 compiler, which is basically a data-driven platform where you can follow everything related to COVID in the US. But also we were able to do some predictions and analysis of like different geographic units in the country and how we can understand the spread and the clustering of the COVID. So very quickly, obviously, these type of dashboards, they became like way more widespread right now, but we are doing this since March. We have a lot of interesting, metrics. You can overlap like, new cases per capita in the last week, which is a very different view than total amount of cases, and population by age. So what you can see here is like new cases per capita in the last week overlaid with percentage of people over the age of 80, and you can see quickly like where are these areas in the country, like very clearly we are bucketing on the fly like all these different types of data. And you can also like, go back in time and like look at what was the situation in May 19 or even like, beginning of the March. One of the main thing that we added as like an addition to this project is the research articles that we have written. And one of them was about predicting COVID-19 in relation to income. And it's very well known in the US at least is COVID has one-to-one relation to income levels, unfortunately. And, we were able to construct like what are the features that they are highly correlated with COVID spread. We first did this in New York City and tested the models, then, projected the model to other cities where we don't actually have the COVID data in granular. So you can see Chicago as well as like Baltimore on the right. Another important thing that was interesting to us is disease models, like how the disease spreads. We basically analyzed the patterns of the spread, like based on total population, population of a certain community, tests per capita, and deaths per capita and things like that. And this allowed us to create models that basically helps us to see country in different clusters, like where are the different types of diseases spreading in different geographic units. So, and the last thing I want to mention, so this is something that I've done with my company, with Topos. And last thing that I want to mention, that I'm actually starting something new, which is basically, it's an archive of failures related to AI, mostly in relation to, race, gender, underrepresented groups, and how certain outcomes of AI, they might be impacting these different audiences. Just very quickly, 2 examples here. The first one is from the Google Image Recognition Service. The same image with different skin color returns different results. So on the left, you see it returns hand and gun. On the one, it returns hand and monocular. Another example is the latest tool that everybody likes to play around is GPT-3. If you feed any text to GPT-3 that has any Muslim or Islam in it, it always generates results with violence. So I just see this as a research project to document all these failures, which frequently happens in the AI practices. So I'm going to pause here, and I think we can proceed with the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mahir. So we're now going to move on to our discussion, and we've got a few themes we want to explore. I'd like to first consider your practice working with AI as process or tool, before we then move on to look at the impact of the pandemic and our response to it. And one of the themes that's been really at the forefront of our work together on experiential AI is the understanding in the AI field that there's limitations in current work on explanation. We need explanation to have accountability in AI, but much work is quite narrowly technical. It doesn't look at the way that algorithms are situated or the wider socioeconomic context. And one of the things we've been interested in is how artists can contribute to demystifying AI. Perhaps we can start and pick up on something that you were discussing, Anna. You were talking about your practice of working with data as material and constructing data sets. And in our conversations about the project you're developing now, you've also presented this concept, well, you and Caroline, of building a complete AI system as your artistic practice. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and say how that makes the invisible visible, how that makes tangible abstract ideas and maybe hidden processes, and how that for you is a means of engaging and understanding the world.
So for me, kind of making data sets has been a huge part of the way that I have been working with AI or machine learning rather so far. I think because, as Drew, as you mentioned, I like to start from the beginning through to the end. So, I'll make the data set, I'll iterate the data, I'll run it, I'll build a model, I'll run it through the model, see what comes out. I am using stuff like style GANs and kind of other open source kind of models, and then modifying them and doing things like that to try and get different outputs, testing them, working with them. But for me, kind of because I'm not a computer scientist, for me, a real kind of lever of control for the output is working with that data set. And because I will kind of have this very intimate connection to it, It takes a really long time. It's often like incredibly physical work. It can be incredibly expensive. Buying lots and lots of different variations of one object is it adds up very quickly. It's a very lengthy process, but it gives you this real kind of like sense of understanding what is happening maybe inside the model. So an example that we talked about was when I was working with the tulips, because I was kind of like, I've always, I've also done a lot of work on kind of like what's kind of like in data sets, what's not in data sets. And I was hyper conscious about making a super balanced data set of flowers. And I was doing 20% white flowers, 20% red flowers, 20% pink flowers, whatever. And I was expecting that what would then come out of the GAN would be a kind of like very balanced kind of thing where it would produce 20% white flowers, 20% yellow flowers. But what happened was that it really overlearned the red flowers. So it was just producing endless red flowers and not that much of the other different colors. And that was something that kind of way that it overlearned certain colors was something that I was only able to understand because I had this really close connection to what I was putting in it and understanding kind of exactly what was going in and how it was kind of moving towards and kind of like overlearning certain different types and certain different shapes. And then I was able to kind of like play with that and balance it out and work with it. And I think unless you kind of really know what you're putting in, then there will always be a certain amount of mystery as to what's coming out. And I think, these things as here you just mentioned, they so often fail very badly. But for me, when you kind of make your own data set and when you're very kind of conscious about what you're putting in and how you're constructing it, those failures are your own failures. So I've done other projects where it kind of really reveals to me quite a lot about my artistic style that I didn't realize before, because it's like this, like I always describe it, it's like kind of like when you catch a glimpse of yourself in a mirror before you realize it's you. It's kind of this weird, uncanny reflection of kind of like what you're trying to do. That kind of like is just both kind of like, it's just a really kind of like, I think, important part of working with machine learning is to have this connection to the data and the data set.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And Mahir, I mean, some of the examples, the fails that you were presenting come from a similar direction. It's the it's the biases, the gaps in the data set. And it's interesting when we've spoken to computer scientists, one of the things that's really striking for them in the artistic practice is that we can change the data and instantly see the result. A lot of the problems you get with AI systems is due to the data being baked in, and it's actually quite hard to actually communicate and illustrate that sort of agency, that collective agency we have over the data set. So we talked about sort of demystification and also about the AI pipeline. I wonder, Mahir, if you could maybe just say a few words on what that looks like to you. I'm turning to you as a computer scientist. So what does that pipeline, what does the AI pipeline look like to you?
Sure. Obviously, this is a big domain to cover, but I just want to give like a couple high-level points about like in order to help demystifying how the AI technologies work as of today, right? I think the first thing is most of the AI tools that we are using they are considered to be a narrow AI. Like there is a specific goal and there is like a specific application for it. And this application is requiring certain set of data, and this data is collected and fed into certain algorithms, and the algorithms is generating some results. The basic example would be like, any type of recommender systems that we see in, online products right now. Like you are following someone on Twitter, Twitter tells you like, follow this other person. Or like deep fake applications. We are giving a lot of like images to the algorithms, and they basically analyze the images and generate similar ones. So I think a couple of high level points about like the pipeline is, first of all, it requires a lot of data. No matter what you're doing, it requires a lot of data, and mostly that there are gaps and noises in this data. and this needs to be cleaned. Or as we were talking, just Anna just mentioned that if you don't do this, then actually failure is inevitable, because whatever the input data is problematic, it represents itself in the outcome as well. I think the other thing to mention here is there is a lot of human labor still involved, both in terms of conceptualizing the projects, but also like labeling the data, especially if the data is required, like, in certain complex applications like self-driving cars. We know that there's a lot of actually offshore companies, their entire job is like, labeling these type of data sets and just providing to the companies that they are doing the research with self-driving cars. So in terms of the pipeline, I think collecting data, preparing data, cleaning data, and just finding the right algorithm and the framework to produce results, it all requires a lot of human input and QA, quality assurance. And I think this is like, one of the main things that mostly, under-accounted in the community. Like, people feel like you just give some data and you get the results. Unfortunately, the realities of today, there's a lot of like work that needs to be done by the humans. And I think like, this is one of the major like, AI pipeline points for me.
Thanks very much. Jake, you gave us a lovely illustration with Zizi, how you're maybe playing with some of the mystification. A really common point is the anthropomorphism. People talk about an AI as if it was a consciousness, and a lot of the fears are sort of tied up in that, and a lot of those fears are exaggerated, just as the claims for what it can achieve is often exaggerated. So I'm interested in how you came to that, and also we're talking about demystification, but the question arises: why would an artist care? Why is this the responsibility of an artist? So yeah, why for you as a practitioner have you been interested in that?
Absolutely, no, thanks, Drew. I think, yeah, there's a lot to unpick there. I think it's a really like rich, exciting area. I think absolutely there are issues when these things are mystified, and I think there has been a fair bit of art made recently using some of these techniques that haven't been entirely honest about the way that those techniques are working, and maybe overly prescribed agency to the machine learning. And I think that can basically add to this fear mongering. And a lot of that is, these anthropomorphizing ideas of like, assigning it consciousness, associating it too much with the way our own brains and consciousness work, which, we have such a limited understanding of. And whilst these things can be really, exciting to explore these much larger philosophical questions, I think, also considering the smaller ethical questions, I guess in the work, the Zizi work, what you were getting at in a way is the sense that we are doing that thing. We are like anthropomorphizing, and in a way we're satiring it by practicing it. It's like we are building AI character, like exactly the thing that maybe I quite often speak out against. But I think in a way that's quite a fun kind of reversal, and maybe thinking about kind of the power and who deepfakes are often made of, the fact they're often made of politicians, or the fact that often people are using these things on Instagram without really considering what's going on, and maybe often overstating what the technology is doing or kind of the agency within that. There are a few things I was thinking about, in terms of how I've been using these things as an artist, and what Anna was saying about creating data sets, which I think is a fascinating thing for an artist, in a way it's like taking the power away from the large companies that are gathering these widely used data sets and kind of making something on a much smaller scale, but that you can really say what you want with. And it's like such an important point, is that we need to be responsible for the data sets we're using and understand where they're coming from and kind of the biases within them. I think there's also an interesting point about artists, which is that as an artist, you can kind of stand outside and reflect on what's going on. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at partly too, Drew, is that there is something quite interesting. You can kind of, you're not culpable, I guess, is the thing. You can kind of say what you want and kind of work out messages, but maybe find ways like of being provocative or finding poetry in these things. And maybe art can be its own kind of form of explainability. I don't know, I think it's something that we're trying to unpack a bit here with the new reel. And I suppose I'm thinking in a way with my previous artworks, maybe it's more a way of illustrating, like to demystify, but in a more loose way and not being too didactic in a kind of explainability way. But it still has its own sense of kind of explainability, getting people to discuss like what's actually going on, what are the social issues, how these techniques are working. But yeah, I think finding like poetry in the mistakes of these systems and playing with these systems, kind of seeing how things emerge out of them, kind of ideas of like dirtying the data set, just finding narratives like by using these things, which has a long history of, and kind of, you know, John Cage and Duchamp and Namjoon Pike and, you know, Harold Cohen, Rachel Ara. I think there's so many artists, Sophie Cal, like conceptual artists and systems artists that have kind of been playing with systems and maybe kind of hacking those systems and finding things to do that they weren't necessarily intended to originally do, or like constructing our own system and seeing how something emerges out of that. So yeah, no, I think there's just like so much rich material for an artist to be exploring. And like I say, you can kind of stand outside and maybe reflect and work out ways to communicate it to a different audience.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to put it in a broader artistic context, and also to compare with design, because the artist role isn't that of a designer. Even if we're sort of maybe between, in the grey space between a little bit, you know, in some ways the role of the artist is to create magic, it is to mystify, and yet there's an interest here in cutting through some of the mystification is harmful, right? It actually contributes to some of these problems. And but I remember when we first met, you had a very immediate interest as an artist, because you know you wanted that process is part of the work, and so an audience engaging in that process and not just thinking it's graphical effects or whatever was really important to you as an artist. So yeah.
And finding ways to open it up by illustrating it, like often just visual means, kind of finding ways of unpicking what's going on. But like I said, I've been so conflicted as an artist. Like when I first started this stuff, I'm like, yeah, you know, machine learning, it's dreaming, it's like AI consciousness. But then I just realized like how harmful that kind of rhetoric and dialogue can actually be in trying to be honest and truthful. And I think as an artist, you should have like responsibility or maybe some culpability, even though I said we don't. But I think we need to hold ourselves accountable and think about how we're communicating this stuff, especially when it's something as large and game-changing as machine learning and AI. So
yeah. And Caroline, we talked earlier about how there's an understanding that there's maybe a gap in some of the existing AI work, research and practice around explaining the broader societal, the way that the algorithms are situated, the societal context and such forth. And you've really talked about you know, placing this in a human rights context. You've really talked about looking at the way that technologies are situated in the world. So how are you bringing in those processes and human protocols into the work? And can this kind of practice lead to AI for good? Can we contribute to new configurations of algorithms and people?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's always important to take a step back and sort of maybe like delineate or start to differentiate parts of the AI landscape. So for example, like there are movements in terms of like ethical or equitable artificial intelligence. Like we see watchdog groups like AI Now, you know, really leading the way on that, especially with also Algorithmic Justice League, right? So like two different groups that are really responding in real time to harms as they come out. There is also like the creation inside of big technology companies like Google with an explainable AI group. I think what's sort of important to highlight is that explainable, legible, trustworthy, and ethical are all different words, and they all mean radically different things. And then within that, you also then have the creation of technology, perhaps like GPT-3, which may be made with best intentions, but as Mahir has pointed out, when you think of like quality assurance or QA testing inside of these different kinds of products, for whatever reason, they're not being tested correctly. And then, you know, and then in the EU, for example, there is there's many movements towards legislating and regulating big technology as well as artificial intelligence systems. So with the European Parliament releasing papers and definitions on their view of trustworthy AI, I think we can start to see more movement towards transparency within that space as well. But all that being said, like we're having all of these disparate conversations. They're not necessarily coming together. And that, I think, is the important thing to think about and look at with artificial intelligence is AI is an infrastructure. It is a sort of broad technology. Mimi Onawa and Diana Nurika in their book, in their zine that they made, describe AI as like salt. It's sort of this additive thing, and it's not an entire meal. And so it's also important to really hold on to that when we talk about things like artificial intelligence systems. It's not this closed entity where we're all accessing the same AI. There are so many different players inside of this space, and that's part of what makes it a massive human rights problem, right? And the interpretation of how we use AI and the way that different research labs or companies or groups of people like use AI in terms of problem solving, the frameworks or questions they ask themselves when making like that, I think is more of the breakdown of the problem. Are groups really sitting there saying like, who's on our research lab? What do they all look like? How old are they? What countries do they come from? What genders are they? Are they really then asking questions of, for the most vulnerable groups, for the most marginalized, how will whatever we're making be used to harm? How will it be used to harm and target those groups? And that kind of self-reflection is not necessarily, I feel comfortable sort of painting with a broad stroke. That's not necessarily the self-reflection we're seeing in all AI groups, right? Some of them may have that. And so, the way that I then think about creating with AI, this is something I talk about with Anna. I'll like often complain being like, where is good AI? I don't know. I'm on the lookout. Please send me examples of AI for good. But I think that it's difficult because on one hand, like AI is this like utility, right? It is not this shiny specific thing that you can easily point to. I've seen interesting work where AI has been used to look at and model climate change, for example. And while that's really helpful, like what's missing often from those papers is then the acknowledgement of that technology and artificial intelligence also then add to climate change as an example. So I think for me, it's such a complicated question because, it's almost like asking, Caroline, where is technology for good? And why does technology harm? Because AI is really, really that expansive, right? It's not this actually very like small thing. It can be used in so many different contexts, and it's misused across so many different contexts. I think for me, then steps towards maybe more equitable AI would be trying to bring in harm reduction and human rights lens. So constantly asking, how can this be used to harm? Why do we need AI in this context? How does it affect, and start, trying to pick specific groups? Like, how could this be harmful towards like Black men in these different countries and these different regions, and really map out all the ways in which whatever you're making can be used for harm. Or how can this be used to harm like queer folks, right? Like, what are the questions that we're asking? And so that's kind of the way I approach solving artificial intelligence. And I guess that would make sense if you then look at my artwork, why a lot of my artwork is really process driven and not necessarily artifact driven, because these are things I grapple with all the time.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I think it's time we move on to the current crisis and consider the situation we face now, both how that's impacting on our practice and also on the broad, just understanding this condition we face. The new real is clearly our take on the new normal. And the sort of premise there, as I mentioned earlier, is that as we become even more reliant on digital interfaces, that we can then become, we can expect that to amplify these impacts that we've been talking about of AI. I wonder, Mahir, if you can maybe knock that around a little bit, maybe challenge that if you want to. So does, the distancing measures, use of these kind of interfaces, which aren't all driven by AI at all, does that make us more vulnerable to misinformation and fake news? And how can we work around this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know how everybody else thinks about this, but to me, the COVID-19 and all the measures like comes with the pandemic is it turns out to be a catalyst to certain things. So we were already in a certain trajectory about certain issues related to AI, related to technology, and the relationship between technology and society. And COVID is like just accelerating them right now. And I think there are a couple of high-level points that we can talk about here. The number one, obviously, is the post-truth, like whatever the definition of facts is becoming more and more like debatable, unfortunately. This has two different reasons. I think one reason is people can't be in physical spaces as much as they used to be. So we need to see things through screens, and we need to find ways to validate them. And the second thing is AI is definitely making some advances, and the manufacturing truth is becoming more and more common and widely available. I think, deep fakes are a great example to this. In so many different ways, we can use this technology or methods in a creative fashion, but at the same time, we can also see actors using them in different ways and trying to distract us from what is the fact itself. The second thing that I was thinking, so the post-truth and acceleration of post-truth is very critical. There will be most probably a reaction to this, building better fact-check tools. Like, I think there's already certain efforts like, identifying like deep fakes, identifying what is actually a constructed image or video or audio, like trying to identify authenticity. That's important. The second thing I personally feel is privatization of communication is like full speed ahead right now. I mean, we are doing this panel over Zoom right now, which is a private company. They have their own goals and own profit, strategies and things like that. So, but every communication is more or less like going through a private company right now. And this will have several impacts, and I think maybe we can deep dive into it a little bit later. And the last thing that I want to mention is I personally feel it's not only related to COVID, but it again like overlaps with the COVID process. We will start also seeing a split, a divided world in AI. Like it's already happening. There's a little bit more gap between China and West recently. For political reasons, but these are basically the two stronghold powers. They produce AI technologies in the world. One is United States mainly, and the other one is China. And it feels like there will be a divided league, like, there will be different AI technologies being shared with different parts of the world. And I personally think that this will bring also additional challenges, but as well as opportunities for creative people and artists.
Thanks very much. Let's discuss how the pandemic has impacted on our practice, but maybe try and tease out some insights that also speak to AI and working with AI. So Anna and Caroline, maybe you can talk a bit about how you've had to adapt in setting out on a new collaboration, and right at the beginning had to rethink that, and we've worked out and found new ways of working. And what are some of the impacts that are maybe specific to an artist working with AI, whether it's to do with accessing server space, or cloud computing, or being on the ground, working together, working remotely. Are there any specific facets of that maybe shine a light on your practice working with AI?
Sure. Anna, do you mind if I start?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So for everyone watching at home, Anna and I actually kicked off our residency with EFI and ours, and then paused it within a few days of March, right before the stay-at-home orders were implemented in both of our countries where we were based. So it was like a whirlwind, like 72-hour trip to Edinburgh. I was trying to race home to Germany before the borders closed. I think I made it 4 days before the borders closed. So much of our collaboration has really been digital. one of the positive things is I feel like it's made our friendship so wonderful and so strong because we talk literally almost every day. But it has been very different. You know, usually when you kick off a fellowship, you will spend time there. And part of the requirement, a delightful requirement for the AI lab is physically being in Edinburgh and then in Linz. And we have not been able to travel to Austria yet. And our travel to Edinburgh was cut much, much shorter than we had anticipated. So a lot of this has just been really, I think, trying to respond to the moment. And then we ended up being, I think, really kind of inspired by being really stuck at home. And that within that, we ended up actually completely, changing a large aspect of the project. We had applied with one idea really focused on labor, and that's still involved. We are very, making a data set is very like labor intensive, but we ended up shifting and wanting to work on what is mechanized cacophony. And a lot of that just sort of came out of our response to being stuck inside, going for walks, and also just thinking about the way that the natural landscape is really juxtaposed with like an industrial landscape in all this, in the cities that we live in, and how oddly like normalized that is. So like, what is the sound of nature? When, for example, I live not very far from a coal processing plant in Germany, but I also live surrounded by trees. So these two things very impacted on top of each other. Or my hometown where I'm from in New Orleans is surrounded by oil refineries, where there's an area just right outside of New Orleans called Cancer Alley, where there's high rates of cancer just due to these oil refinery plants. And so really thinking about the fact that, you know, so much of like the modern landscape actually are these really detrimental, highly industrialized spaces next to these moments of nature. And so part of that was like Anna and I started having these reflections during COVID. Anna, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think kind of like to kind of like unpick your question, Drew, about like, because I think there are two kind of separate answers. One is like, how does this affect work in relation to AI, and how does kind of like the global pandemic and COVID impact working as an artist? And I think for me, they've kind of been two separate things. For the AI stuff, it's been very much kind of like the difficulty of creating a data set when you're just constrained to being in your house for so long, or just working with material that you have already collected. So kind of like being able to go out into the world and find things that you want to kind of like document has actually been like such a difficult thing to do during, particularly during hard lockdown. And I think even though Caroline and I have done a pretty good job in kind of collaborating remotely, it is a very different process. I think when you're kind of trying to build a residency and work kind of like collaboratively with someone who isn't based in the same city and who've never done it before, I think something is missing by not being in the physical space together and working together. And I think it's been a lot of kind of like feeling into a rhythm, which I didn't necessarily anticipate. Well, no one anticipated kind of like when we started it. But I think I've actually had perhaps a very different COVID experience from maybe other people on the panel. I lost someone in my immediate family quite early on during COVID. And so a lot of kind of like this period has also been a period of grieving, and grieving through technology. And that's kind of like, and I think for me, one of the things that kind of came out of that is kind of understanding the limitations that technology does have when you're kind of responding to these deeply kind of like emotional needs. All of the rituals that happen face to face can't be replicated with technology. So I think a lot of what's coming out of the project that Caroline and I are working on is really understanding kind of like this gap between kind of reality and kind of like and technology.
Thanks, Anna, and yeah, we're all very sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
Jake, one really striking aspect of your project has been the way that you've mobilized and engaged with a specific community, the drag community. And I've loved talking to you and just the way you've gone about that and the strategies you've used, and what that kind of tells us on so many levels, both about the way that communities come together and the impact of the pandemic, and how you've had to bring people together since, both in physical spaces, also some of the things the things I've learned about the drag community, and in virtual spaces. Do you want to just talk us through some of that? It's a story that we still haven't told properly. It's not going to come out now.
Absolutely.
Give us a little insight.
Yeah. Well, I think a good word in a way is resilience. I think this idea of using art as a form of resilience and thinking maybe about the LGBTQ plus community in lockdown at the moment, who may have been in very vulnerable positions or in hostile environments during lockdown, and the fact they can't go to queer spaces or venues at the moment. So I think, in a way, the project was partly thinking that through and having that in mind. And, you know, how to kind of create the feeling of this homeliness or safe space, perhaps, for people who are really missing going to these venues and going and seeing live drag performance. I think, yeah, there are some really interesting examples at the moment of like digital drag. And I guess, as you might think, you know, as performers, people are really quite out of work and in quite tenuous positions. So it's been lovely, you know, having some funding to make a project and being able to offer some work to some of these performers who are unbelievably talented. But there have been a few other examples that I've seen of, you know, the ways that digital drag, that the community has still been resilient through lockdown in using live streaming technology, kind of using old theatres that are on the brink of shutting down, but being able to go in with a skeleton crew and live stream through that. There's a lovely example that was written about in The Guardian recently. A few friends of mine, Harry Gay and Liv Winter, they set up a piece called Queer House Party, which was on Zoom, and it was just the most heartwarming thing. It was so simple. It was just kind of creating a club night, queer night experience that anyone can join from their living room. But the way that you could kind of flick between everyone else and see what they were doing, and them getting in drag and dressed up and performing in this space, and this kind of sense of comfort. I mean, I guess for me, lockdown hasn't changed a huge amount. I'm quite used to being kind of an independent artist who has to kind of rely on myself and self-initiating projects. I'm in the very privileged position that I can support myself as an artist. So quite used to having lots of unstructured time. And I think, you know, obviously lots of shows and residencies have been cancelled, but it's kind of been a bit of a strange time. But obviously this project, this Easy project, was all about collaboration and working with performers and taking things to stage. And of course, none of that's been able to happen. So we've had to kind of dramatically pivot and think about how we can, you know, how you even start creating a sense of like a virtual performance and what that means, and how we can kind of rethink theatre and performance and queer space through virtual spaces and do it in a sensitive way. So that's kind of what we're grappling with at the moment.
Yeah. Anna, coming over to you, we talked earlier with Jake about the role of the artist, and we've touched on some quite big, you know, social themes here. What's the role to you of artists in this? You know, and what's the significance of that? What can artists bring to these issues? Is it about creating metaphors? You know, and why is that important?
Do you mean kind of like, why are artists working at this time with AI?
I'm interested in, you know, how artists are helping us negotiate these challenges we face. What do you, for you, what's the role of artists in helping us do that?
I think for me, it is a way of kind of, in a way, I think we're kind of like almost too close to what's happening now to kind of fully understand what will come out. I think it's more kind of, it's important, I think, for artists to kind of think through these themes and explore kind of how COVID and the pandemic is impacting the world, because I think as artists kind of we're constantly responding to kind of like what's going on. And I think for me, it's just a way of kind of like thinking through these things. Caroline, I don't know if you have anything to add on this.
Sure. I mean, just thinking through like metaphors and in terms of art as a way to unpack AI. I don't know. I mean, I think, well, I guess it's so hard, I think, in terms of explaining like one colossal thing, right? And but that's where I think art can be sort of extremely helpful in the space of being able to take a small facet of something and really, really explore it through all different kinds of mechanisms and ways. There are like two projects I'm a really big fan of in terms of explaining one, data politics, and then the other sort of the fallibility of machine learning. So the first one is Mimi Onawa's The Library of Missing Data Sets, is this really beautiful way to talk about and just really immediately show the weight of what data means and what are all the intricacies of data. That's also actually what I love about Anna's work as well, is you see the physicality of what usually is digital. So like the printing out of all of the tulips adds this kind of like extreme physicality. I think with Feminist Dataset, when it's done, it'll be interesting to see the amount of research and how do you show that in terms of just being able to make something from start to finish. It's actually fairly arduous. The other project where I was mentioning like the erroneousness, the fallibility of machine learning is Heather Dewey Hagberg's Probably Chelsea. So you see all of these different faces that are generated from a machine learning algorithm of Chelsea Manning's DNA, and none of them look like Chelsea. And none of these are necessarily like that wrong in terms of like a probability percentage. And so I think that there's this great way that you can use art to comment on artificial intelligence, but then you can also use art as a way to sort of explore machine learning as well, which is part of what our project is sort of, I mean, we hope it will do. It's sort of hard to speak about it in this sense because we are still in the process of making it, but we're hoping to uncover so many things about, the overlap of climate change and machine learning, and then using machine learning to then explore our own relationships to loss, especially around climate and these ideas of climate grief, for example.
Yeah, I think that's kind of something that has come out of this process, is marrying the kind of like personal grief that we're all feeling with these kind of wider, longer term grief that sometimes like is harder to collapse when it's so big. So the different scales is something that kind of like, I think art can do, is bring something that is maybe so huge and insurmountable to comprehend into something that can kind of maybe have this personal connection to people. I think we're also kind of, as Caroline mentioned, we're also really interested, I think, in how artistic research can fully push kind of ideas forward. Another great example is obviously Kate Crawford's work, where even though it's an art, or I say even though, it kind of has been conceptualized as maybe an artistic project or an essay, but it ends up having real world impacts. And I think that's something that kind of like people often forget, the power that these projects can have, especially in these technologies that are so kind of like they're not kind of yet solidified into kind of like being in certain ways and formats, that there still is the chance for these different projects that surface these problems to have an actual impact on how things are carried forward.
And Mahir, I mean, we're thinking there about how art can maybe signpost issues or help us navigate them. What do you see as some of the issues that are going to be important as we move forward? Perhaps arising due to the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think Caroline and Anna, they gave a great response to the question related to artists and what the artists can do. I also want to think a little bit higher level and maybe talk about what is happening in the AI landscape in general. And if you think about that, I mean, there are a couple of things that we know very well about these applications and processes, right? They are mostly invented by big tech companies. They are research departments in collaboration with universities, but they are like, distributed through these companies and their research teams. And the reason for this, actually, you need mostly a lot of resources to, make advances in these technologies, as well as you need a lot of data. I think one thing that is currently happening right now that big tech is definitely benefiting from the situation in many ways, not only related to AI, but specific to AI. I think what's happening is they are able to harvest a lot of new data because, there is significantly more activity happening in the digital space right now, which may not be a problem, but at the same time, I think this is something that they should be more responsible and maybe accountable as well. What I kind of like summarize this as like more remote work, more remote panels, more remote education, whatever we call is equals to more data generation. And this is not a problem because we need data to do any form of AI. But I think who actually controls and owns this, I think it should be like more critically discussed. Another important thing that I see, especially in the US, I'm not actually fully aware what is the situation in Europe in detail, but because of the nature of the disease, it has a lot to do with location, right? Where you are you indoor, outdoor? And are you close to other people? Contact tracing technologies, they were like, becoming at least a discussion point here. But now it feels like, all those discussions are somewhat settled without actually a meaningful conclusion. And we are becoming more and more okay giving up on privacy and just like, sharing our data with bigger companies. And this can be, harvested and used to predict like, what certain areas might be more vulnerable in certain ways, which again, it might be like a helpful effort for mitigating the crisis. But I think it's also changing the behaviors of people about their privacy concerns. So this is another interesting development that I observe personally. People are kind of forced to choose convenience over privacy. Which might have interesting results in the AI landscape because location data specifically was very, very, like a big concern for a lot of people before the pandemic. But now we know that, okay, if we can have all of your location history, we can do contact tracing better and things like that. So I think that there is a lot of new data and more data being available. Unfortunately, not to public yet, but mostly to big companies. And how this is actually being used or how this is going to actually will change the AI landscape is kind of a question mark at the point.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a really important point. One of the things that we can expect to see is just that widening gap and centralization, that those large companies that are equipped to provide those services now are going to be harvesting that data, whereas others who aren't will clearly not, and that's a key issue. And going back to the artistic contribution, as it were, what's really interesting here is that the practice we've been talking about is of you guys creating your own data sets, training your own models, and I think that really stands as a really important counterpoint and an inspiration, and it does raise many interesting questions. I mean, Jake, to go back to the context that you've been working in, quite clearly one thing that's doing is it's addressing a bias, it's addressing the lack of representativity, the lack of representation for one community in the data set. But I've got to ask, is representation in data always a good thing? Are there times when people may not want to be represented in the data? And is that an issue here? Do you have a responsibility for that with your work with the drag community?
I think that's, such an interesting point and such a good point, that it's not always about representation. There's like an issue there. It's ownership of data, and exactly as Mahir was saying, it's who owns this data. And I've had such interesting conversations in like the smoking area of queer bars even before lockdown, where I was talking to members of the trans community and the drag community and friends of mine who were kind of saying, hang on a sec, we don't want to be part of their data set. What are you doing? Why are you making AI drag? It's like this idea that they didn't want to be part of a large company's data set. And I think that reaction is so interesting. It's this, I had to assure them, like, I'm keeping this data very confidential, and that like doing it all consensually. I think that's such an important thing, that I'm getting consent from everyone that I'm using. I'm explaining exactly how the data is going to be used, and it's my private data set that's not being shared with anyone else. But I think it's a really interesting question, and something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. So this idea of inclusion versus, I guess, like assimilation, or kind of colonializing, someone else's culture or identity or whatever that may be. And then also, I guess within that, there's also this other idea of like, whether we want representation, whether we want to be recognized, or whether we could actually flip this on its head and talk about like obfuscation. And I think there's some really interesting projects in art that's been kind of exploring that, and this idea of like dirtying the data sets, or like using almost like queerness as a weapon against AI algorithms. And I think there's some really cool examples, like Zach Blass did a lovely piece with jewelry where he worked on that, and Joy Barlam-Weenie did some really interesting pieces looking at facial recognition and how you can kind of use makeup to kind of obfuscate these systems. There's also someone called Morgan Klaus Schierman, I think, who's looking at how artificial intelligence and machine learning directly affects trans people, which is like a really interesting research project. But in a way, I don't know, I feel like as an artist, I feel really hopeful. And I think it's really important to like say something fun, and I mean, have fun with it and say something and be playful and still use humor, and I guess like to engage a wider audience, engage more people. Like using humor is such an important weapon. So I think I do generally have quite a hopeful view that maybe human-machine collaboration can really fuel people's creativity and push people to do really amazing things and encourage human creativity. But obviously, yeah, also aware there are definitely issues we need to work on. But I guess this sense of like trying to empower people, and maybe art can do a tiny bit of that, and trying to get more people into the conversation to feel that they can get involved and like help actually shape and change this technology.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly say, just to stick my neck out there, that ZZ certainly brings some hope and joy, and maybe, Caroline, there's an example of AI for good. In our conversations in Edinburgh with some of the AI community up there, one point that's been made by ethicists such as Shannon Valor is that whilst it's vital to address bias in data sets and training data sets, and some of the real horrific sort of outcomes we've seen have been driven by that, that can almost take up too much of our attention, and we also need to look at how AI is situated in the world, and how it can be applied by police forces against minorities and cause problems that are nothing to do with gaps in the data set. And I think that there's another dimension here which we've touched on, but maybe it'd be good to pull out more next time. And that's the way that through art we can explore and demonstrate that feedback loop between the AI and the human. I'm conscious of time, and we're going to be brought to a close soon. And I did want to give a chance to just go around the room for any closing remarks. So maybe I could invite each of you just to say a few words, just to close us out on navigating the new real. So, do you have any pointers, any insights, any advice, recommendations, maybe for cultural organizations out there, for artists, or for any of us about navigating the new real? And I'm going to go in random order. I'm going to go start with Caroline.
I had a feeling you were going to pick me first, Drew.
That's having a blue background.
Probably. I mean, I think this is a great moment to sort of advocate for kindness, in the sense that we're all suffering through a global pandemic. But I think it's also a moment to really deeply reflect on our own internal biases, the ways that we are culpable, whether realizing it or not, in systemic injustice that exists in society, and then what are ways that we can change our approach to the work that we create, to like the systems that we exist in terms of like working towards like more systemic equity as opposed to inequity. So I think this is a good moment in this new normal to really take a pause and then start to figure out like what is the world that we want to build and exist in. And I realize that these maybe sound like very idealistic views, but you know, this is like a moment for reset. I think when people talk about the new normal, we often think of it just as COVID, but it's not just that. And COVID is both a mirror to society as well as like a shifting and changing of society. The mirror is more clearly seeing the injustice that's around us. The shifting is the fact that none of us are in the same space right now, and we don't know how long that will be for. And so as opposed to just thinking about it as this temporary thing, maybe this is a time for a massive reset.
Yeah, beautifully put. Mahir.
Well, it's hard to go after Caroline's statement, to be honest, but that was pretty strong. Well, I can piggyback on it a little bit. I think one of the things, as I said, it's a catalyst moment, right? It's for a lot of things, and unfortunately, most of those things are not good for an open and free society in the world and equal society. AI is a tool that has this amazing powers to change things, make things more profitable, make things more optimized, efficient, accurate, and so on and so on. It's a very utility-driven concept that we have in life right now. I think one thing that we might all consider as researchers, artists, educators, or even like regular people in the society not knowing anything about this, we should be part of this more. I think there should be more like, active engagement and demand from companies, governments, institutions, like, spearheading these technologies. We should hold them more accountable for the things that they are producing and building. And we can use this moment to understand the technologies and the processes better, and also make ourselves integrated to those technologies better. I think this is a great opportunity moment, as much as it's a challenging moment, that everyone should be part of this process. That's my feeling. Maybe it's not easy to understand at the beginning. Maybe it's not easy to learn, but eventually it's going to work. And I think this is very critical for the future of our societies.
Thank you, Mahir. Anna?
Yeah, just to kind of echo kind of what has already been said, this is such a pivotal moment and such an opportunity to kind of reflect, what is the world that we want to have. I think one of the things that has maybe happened during the pandemic is that people kind of realize the value of their own time, and also kind of like, because there's so much kind of that you kind of maybe would have not necessarily been able to, that you're having to do all at once. I'm thinking of all of the parents who have to look up to their kids, and you're having to kind of have your whole life from one space. You're suddenly not able to kind of see how things kind of like get done for you maybe. And so I think people kind of like are also viewing news a lot more, and kind of understanding what is happening in the world at the moment a lot more, and have the opportunity now to reflect on that. And I think there is just, there's so much that is happening, and now that people are kind of engaging with it, I think there is this moment for change. And I am cautiously optimistic that things will get better, because I think people are more and more becoming more engaged with the world around them.
Fantastic. I love a little optimism in these dark and crazy times. Jake, last but definitely not least, over to you.
I'm not sure if I have too much to add from what I was saying before, but I think Yeah, it's such a rich area. One thing that occurred to me was about listening to Mahir talk earlier about, the data set consumption. Is there's I was having a very interesting conversation with an engineer who was telling me about something called federated AI and this idea of like decentralized data sets. I think that's something that's really interesting to maybe explore, and kind of how we can kind of build towards something more decentralized when it comes to machine learning. But I think Anna's so hitting the nail on the head with the fact that we have time right now to like reshape the conversation and really think about what we're trying to say and what we're trying to change and how to articulate that. And I think as artists, that is kind of what we're doing. We're trying, it's social commentary, it's thinking about how to discuss these things, engage people with them. But I think also it's important to say, for art, it's okay not to always be loud and polemic. You can also be more quiet and poetic sometimes. And I think there's definitely always a place for that. But like I said before, yeah, I think art is a place for kind of humor and hope and empowerment to hopefully get more people to start talking about this stuff.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're right on the hour. So I'm going to thank Jake, Anna, Mahir, and Caroline. I'm going to remind you all that the new reel opens on the 17th of October. You can find us at newreel.cc, and we look forward to seeing you there. There'll be more discussion events and the release of the artworks then. So yeah, come and join us then, and thanks for joining us now. Thank you.